In the mid-90s, a young surgeon in the UK was approached by a woman by the name of Rosemary Keswick, whose son had begun to suffer from inflammatory bowel disease. The boy had also recently begun to regress with his developmental milestones. The surgeon sought out by the mother was a specialist in gut and liver transplantation and was a senior lecturer at the Royal Free Hospital School of Medicine, London, an up-and-coming junior faculty member. He took on the case of Rosemary Keswick's son and began to investigate why it was that the child would develop both cerebral and gastrointestinal dysfunction simultaneously. On review of systems, the surgeon discovered that the child had been healthy up until the time of his first measles-mumps-rubella vaccine, the MMR. He found this rather curious, and considered whether other patients had a similar experience. Through a network of colleagues, he was ultimately approached by other families whose children also suffered from autism, 8 of whom had received the same series of vaccines. Ultimately, the surgeon was hired by several lawyers in order to bring the vaccination companies to justice. In 1998, he wrote up his findings and published them in Lancet as a case series. Only there were a few problems, and we have the incredible research by one Brian Deere to thank for this. First, the case series was reported as a consecutive enrollment of patients, when in fact these patients were selectively identified by the investigators through the MMR campaign group, whose purpose was entirely to discredit vaccinations. One patient was even flown in from the US to be seen by that doctor who would blame autism on the MMR. Hardly a random selection of patients who showed up to their hospital. Second, the surgeon failed to acknowledge relevant financial disclosures. At the time, he was contracted for hundreds of thousands of British pounds to discredit the vaccine companies. In addition, he had submitted his own patent for an independent measles vaccine, which only could have profited off the defamation of the MMR. So, a couple of conflicts of interest there. Third, he made up data. Independent review of the included patients' medical records led to the discovery that some kids weren't even autistic to begin with, and some had autistic features that predated the MMR. After reviewing the GI histology, none of the kids had colitis either. Most were just constipated. Of the 12 patients in this original cohort, not a single case was free of falsified data. And in spite of this horrifying scandal of medical inquiry, these allegations remain critical components of an anti-vaccination movement that is harming children and families by the thousands. Hi, podcast listeners. Jim Siegler here for BrainWaves, a podcast about neurology and medicine and all the fascinating science and history that come with it. It's been 21 years since the original publication of Andrew Wakefield's falsified manuscript linking the MMR vaccine to autism. And for all the children who were born to parents that did not give in to this impressive and shocking medical lie, now those children have grown up. They're old enough to vote, old enough to fight in the military, old enough to enjoy a beer, and they're getting to that age where they might too have their own kids. But for others, well, they haven't been so lucky. This week on the program, we'll be talking about this anti-vax movement, the clinical data, the controversies in the media, and the perspective of the pediatrician.
It's not that vaccines are without risk. All medical interventions run the possibility of causing an adverse reaction.
At the end of the program, I'd love to get your thoughts on all of this. So pull out your phone, find me on Twitter at BrainWaves Audio or Facebook at facebook.com/BrainWaves Audio, and start up a conversation. Let's keep this important dialogue open and bring all the facts to light. For the listeners out there who may remember some of the older episodes of the show, you may recognize Erika Mejia.
Hi.
Erika, my lovely wife, is a pediatrician here in Philadelphia.
Hi, my name's Erika Mejia. I'm a board-certified pediatrician.
And she was kind enough to share her own opinions on the risks and the benefits of vaccines for this show.
And I'm currently a pediatric cardiology fellow.
Her opinion on this matter is obviously more important than mine, so I wanted to make sure that you all heard more than just my own perspective on vaccines, also hers, as she gets this question all the time.
Even though I'm a pediatric cardiology fellow, vaccine still comes up in many of my patients. It was a concern for many families, especially because a lot of the patients I see, they're newborns and we follow them throughout the course of their lives. And we have had a few families come in expressing that they have elected to not vaccinate their children. And when we ask them why, Some of them have expressed concerns that vaccines can cause autism, or that they're concerned about the components of the vaccine, that there may be mercury, and then that in and of itself can cause harm to the infant.
Would you say it's a common problem that people bring up?
No, I wouldn't say it's a common problem. It's most of the patients that we see and most of the families that we see elect to vaccinate their children. There are a few cases where the child, due to an immune compromised status or due to an evaluation, their vaccine schedule is just delayed or prolonged. But every now and then we do have families that do come in with that concern.
In organizing this week's program, I put together a couple of statements that I've come across on social media with the hope that we can illuminate the truth, or at least dispel any myths or misunderstandings about vaccines. Here we go.
Fact or fiction? Measles is a preventable viral illness which otherwise can cause fevers, rash, pneumonia, paralysis, or even death.
So we're starting off with a softball here, but it's important to set the stage. This one is a fact.
Something that is completely, utterly preventable.
Often with measles, patients feel flu-like symptoms. They can develop a whole body rash, and a week later, they survive the illness. However, the fact of the matter is, more than 100,000 people die every year because of measles. The perceived mildness of the symptoms is one of the most common reasons that parents choose not to vaccinate their kids. The worry is that, especially with younger kids who can't mount a successful immune response to the virus, same goes for the elderly and immunocompromised, measles could be life-threatening. According to the CDC, approximately 1 in 5 persons in the U.S. who were infected with measles before 2000 were hospitalized for it. As many as 6% developed pneumonia, and 1 in 1,000 could even develop a post-infectious encephalomyelitis. This means high fevers, altered mental status, seizures, and even focal deficits. A quarter of the patients who did get that measles-associated encephalomyelitis would eventually die because of that disease, with another 33% having severe lifelong disability, blindness, weakness, cognitive impairment, and so on. More rarely, as you might recall from med school, is that complication of subacute sclerosing panencephalitis, a condition which follows the initial viral symptoms by several years. Patients will manifest with intellectual decline, changes in behavior, seizures, and progress rapidly into dementia and eventually coma. It's almost universally fatal, and it progresses over 1 to 3 years. Thankfully, SSPE is rare, and according to published epidemiologic data, it may affect about 5 to 10 out of every 100,000 patients with measles. But let's put it into a different context for you, and consider the outbreak in Portland from this year.
But for us, it's a calm start here in Portland. We are seeing clear skies and a nice sunrise here.
The outbreak grew from 1 patient to 60 in just 1 month's time, and none of those infected were previously vaccinated.
Experts here warn the public might have been exposed at a recent Portland Trailblazers game, at Portland's airport, at area schools, a local Costco, and IKEA. Washington State has been called out.
What I'd like to do next is extrapolate upon these numbers a bit, these 60 patients who acquired measles. Portland's home to maybe 650,000 people, who welcome about 45,000 newborns every year. 8% of Portland infants are completely unvaccinated, and probably even more don't receive that second dose of the MMR. So let's say 12% aren't fully immunized, 5,000 newborns. Erika and I talked about these numbers.
So let's say 12% aren't fully immunized. That would be about 5,000 of the 45,000 born that year.
Again, we're just talking about the city of Portland.
We can't say that all 100% of them are going to contract it when we know that the infection rate is 90%.
A 90% infection rate is what we know based on data according to the Centers for Disease Control.
But just to make the math easier, let's say that all 5,000 of them do get the measles. So that would mean that about 1,000 children would end up being hospitalized every year.
And to handle this volume, Eric and I quickly looked up on Google Maps. There are 3 major children's hospitals covering the city of Portland.
So roughly about 300 kids per hospital, or 25 admissions per month.
Again, this is just a worst-case scenario, and we're only talking about newborns.
300 of these kids might have a severe pneumonia.
because that's what 6% of patients have historically developed due to measles.
And 50 would develop encephalomyelitis.
That previously mentioned 0.1 to 1% risk.
And that's not to mention the fact that the other 40,000 newborns from that year are still at risk.
These are the 40,000 other newborns who have zero immune system and would be freakishly vulnerable to all those infected infants around them, because these 40,000 would not have been able to receive their first MMR vaccine until 12 to 15 months. And then we've got all those other people out there who are immunocompromised, and they can't even get vaccinated for health reasons, not personal ones.
Fact or fiction? If you're infected with measles, you can transmit the virus for up to 4 days before you develop a rash.
This next statement is also a fact. The truth is, patients are often most infectious during those 3 days before the rash appears. Usually, this is when cough and fevers, sore throat, headaches, and other nonspecific symptoms begin.
It's in those 4 days when they have a fever, they're not feeling well, right? All these are common cold symptoms that a parent would, any caregiver, parent, teacher, daycare provider would struggle with identifying as, oh, this is measles versus this is just the sniffles.
There's also been plenty of good data showing that you don't even need direct contact with an infected person, that the virus can survive outside of its host for several hours.
The highly contagious virus can live on surfaces or in the air for up to 2 hours.
For a virus that's, to be perfectly honest, incredibly rare in the US, even with all this hype in the media about it, nobody's going to panic about that kid with a runny nose or a low-grade fever. They're probably not going to pay much attention to them until that fever really picks up. And then it's too late.
It's just that these symptoms are hard to discern from the common cold. So, fact or fiction? A person infected with measles can infect up to 50% of those around them if they are unvaccinated.
I'm afraid that we gave this one away earlier in the show. This is a fictional statement. The risk of transmitting the virus from one person to another is not 50%.
It's actually a 90% risk of transmission if you're unvaccinated.
You heard Erika right. 90%. That's a 9 out of 10 chance, if you come into physical contact with somebody who's shedding the virus, that you will become infected yourself. Put another way, some virologists use the R0 to describe the transmissibility of a virus. This is an estimate of the number of persons a single person could eventually infect. Flu, for instance, has an R0 of 2 to 3, which is pretty bad. Smallpox, even worse, R0 of 5 to 7. Measles has one of the highest known R0s, between 9 and 18, meaning an infected person has the potential to infect as many as a dozen others.
It's also about when you get it, right? Because if you're a baby, an infant, and you get the measles, that's really, really bad in terms of your ability to cope with the illness, as opposed to a 20-year-old who catches the measles. Those are two very distinct individuals.
And if you happen to be immunocompromised, you are orders of magnitude more likely to die from the infection. In HIV patients, fatality rates with measles are as high as 40%, and among cancer patients, it can be as high as 70%. Or if you're just a healthy, middle-aged woman who happens to be pregnant and unvaccinated, you run the risk of miscarriage or premature delivery.
Fact or fiction? The vaccine used to prevent measles can cause autism and or bowel disease.
For 14 years, that MMR vaccine is causally associated with autism.
And not just that the MMR vaccine causes autism. That was Andrew Wakefield, by the way. But that our own government, the U.S. government, is covering it up.
Claims that the CDC, America's Centers for Disease Control, manipulated and hid data that proves that there is a link between vaccines and autism.
This is total fiction. I can't believe we're really still having this conversation nowadays, but it hits on so many important points. The influence of social media, the relevance of financial disclosures and conflicts of interest when publishing clinical research, the limitations of multiple hypothesis testing, and all of them have converged into this single horrifying misunderstanding that autism is related to vaccines. So quickly, to review the facts here for you, as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, the connection between the MMR vaccine and autism, as well as bowel disease, it stems from that 1998 Lancet paper published by Andrew Wakefield, in which he and his co-authors reported 12 patients in the UK who experienced developmental regression and autistic features following the MMR vaccine.
When families express their concern about vaccines causing autism, we know the paper that they're referencing.
This was wholly fraudulent work. Wakefield had already committed himself to discrediting the company that produced the MMR vaccine, as he himself was trying to patent his own vaccine. And furthermore, he was hired by lawyers to represent some of the patients he even wrote about. It was likely a combination of these conflicts of interest that drove him to publish the work. But that still doesn't give him permission to falsify the data, which is exactly what he did for all the patients. None of the patients had any bowel disease, as the authors claimed, after we had independent investigators adjudicate that histopathology. Some of the patients didn't even have autism, and those who had cognitive impairment had symptoms that predated the MMR. And just to give credit to the work of others here, many have tried to replicate Wakefield's data, and to this day, we still have no evidence to support these accusations.
That the findings of that study have been completely disproven by multiple subsequent studies.
Then there's this added pressure that's put on our credible scientific officials by hoaxers out there that the CDC is lying to us about this association.
And they have covered it up.
Which is also completely unfounded. This gets into some of the issues that are inherent to selection bias and the limitations of multiple hypothesis testing. What hoaxers believe the CDC to have covered up is a finding that African American children who received the second dose of the MMR earlier in their childhood, these kids were 3.5 times more likely to develop autism. Bear in mind, this is, quote, a statistically significant finding. And it's true, this was a statistically significant finding. But I can talk all day about statistical significance. If you were to look at 4 subgroups of ethnicity, Caucasian, African American, Asian, and Hispanic, all independently, and then divide each subgroup into 5 age ranges, 12 to 18 months, 18 to 24 months, and so on, or 5 regions in the US, all independently, the odds are one of these subgroups may have an independent association with autism. With more than 20 random comparisons being made, you are bound to find a spurious association due to chance alone. Diehard statisticians will tell you this means nothing. I might be a little more lenient and say it's hard to know what these spurious associations mean, but I'll concede that there's zero biologic plausibility that African American children who receive this vaccine at a younger age are more likely to develop autism.
Fact or fiction? Nothing all that bad really happened after Andrew Wakefield published his paper linking vaccines to autism.
Fiction. And you and I talked about this before we started to record the show, because it wasn't exactly all attributed to Andrew Wakefield's paper that people changed their opinions and families decided not to take the vaccines. But certainly the publication of this paper really shook the medical community. And if it took 12 years before Lancet redacted the article, that was 12 years of science being promoted in the community.
Yeah, no, there are various reasons why families may not want to vaccinate their children. One reason that is stated is autism, and it's probably because of this paper that they have brought up this concern. We had
What I'll also say here is that while it's only been 9 years since the Wakefield paper was retracted for vaccine rates in the UK to climb back to normal, there have been over 12,000 cases of measles in the UK alone, hundreds of hospitalizations, and at least 3 known deaths. And that's just in the UK. As I said before, measles kills 100,000 people every year. But if you imagine the impact this paper had on the UK, the proportion of vaccinated children in the UK fell from 92% in 1998 to 78% in 2005. If we think about how this has affected our own country, the United States, between January and May of 2019, there have already been more than 760 cases of measles.
Real concern over measles, and tonight a public health emergency has now been declared in Washington state. And
760 may seem kind of like a small number, but it's more than double the 372 that was reported by the CDC for all of 2018. And even that number had tripled the number of cases in the prior year.
The number of measles infections has tripled just since last year, David.
So we eliminated in the United States measles in the year 2000, right? And now we had 760 cases, right, in this year alone, which is wild.
New York State has registered 184 measles cases in just the past 4 months.
Now, we are seeing the highest rate of measles this country has seen since it was declared eliminated from the U.S. in the year 2000.
Absolutely wild. It was a disease that was not in the United States. Fact or fiction? Even years after the retraction of Wakefield's paper, Donald Trump still believes vaccines cause autism.
We'll give you a second on this.
Yes, this is a fact.
Oh yeah, it's a fact. 5:35 a.m., March 24th, 2014, Trump tweets, "Healthy young child goes to doctor, gets pumped with massive shot of mini vaccines, doesn't feel good and changes. Autism." That's in all caps. Many such cases, exclamation point. I've put a link to this tweet in the show notes this week, just in case you want to verify it. The thread following Trump's tweet is as hilarious as it is alarming. And the fact that some people can get so many likes and retweets for posting sheer garbage is disturbing. You know, I didn't believe it myself.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the problem when... Well, I think that when a public figure makes a statement like that, the concern is that many people will find that credible, and understandably so, right? If a significant public figure like the president makes a scientific statement, and if the president is making that statement, then many people are going to believe them because we believe that he or she, that he is getting their information from reliable sources and that it's been filtered and vetted. And so it would make sense why a lot of people would trust what they would say. But when it's erroneous like that, that causes a significant amount of harm to the community. And I think that it really is the onus of the public figure to make sure that the information that they're disseminating is accurate.
Yeah, because nobody goes back and fact checks Twitter. You know, people are looking at Twitter for immediate information and they just absorb whatever's out there. It's very passive acquisition of data. Not a lot of people are actively criticizing or giving feedback to those kinds of things. All right, last statement. Erika, what do you got?
Fact or fiction? Vaccines cause harm.
A clever person can argue that nothing in this world is perfectly safe. Not fresh vegetables, not airbags, not even oxygen. The question is, as I'm sure you know, does the benefit outweigh the risk?
Vaccines, like all other medical interventions, have adverse side effects. So overall, the benefits of a vaccine are greater than the risks. But are there risks? Definitely.
So, in a sense, vaccines are not perfectly benign. Well, what are the risks then, you might ask? For the MMR, here's what we know.
The vaccine can cause a fever in 5 to 15% of patients, a rash in 5%, and then in fewer than 1%, they can have an anaphylactic reaction, which is a severe adverse event.
And then in fewer than 1% of patients, we do see more serious risks that are worth mentioning. And although I'm still in full support of our current vaccination program, I would say that we do a poor job of at least completely informing our patients about the risks of these treatments. So here are the concerning risks. According to the Institute on Medicine, the MMR has been associated with anaphylaxis in patients who are allergic to its components. No surprise there. The MMR increases the risk of encephalitis in immunocompromised patients, and the MMR can cause febrile seizures, which is practically never a chronic problem, nor does it typically lead to any long-term disability. So if you'd prefer not to get your seizures from the MMR vaccine, and you'd rather have seizures from measles encephalitis, then you can be my guest. All this being said, what are we left with? How about I ask you this question? So what can we do to correct this problem?
Well, I think it's important to talk about it as healthcare providers, reassure families, ask them what their concerns are. Because again, not everyone's concerns about the MMR vaccine is about autism. But if it is about autism, then we can say that we have the science to show that the MMR vaccine does not cause autism. And that's really important for families to know.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. We are advocates for our patients and for science and empirical medicine, and what we say matters. And I would say it matters as much, if not more, than our political leaders or other people who carry more social media support. I think that our voices need to be heard just as much as theirs do. As we're wrapping up today's program, on a more personal note, since Erika and I are expecting our first child this coming July, I am extremely unnerved by the thought of taking the baby out in public before the baby gets their full complement of vaccines. There are so many histrionic people out there, people like Donald Trump, highly respected world leaders, who think that vaccines cause autism, and parents out there who refuse to get their children vaccinated because they have completely unfounded concerns. And people are listening to them. Fake news regarding vaccine risks are spreading as fast as the measles outbreak is spreading. If there's one thing to take away from this show, and I think we've covered a lot of important points, one final point to reflect on is how our present understanding of vaccines fits into our history of medical practice. I'll bet not a single listener of this podcast was around for the Spanish influenza outbreak of 1918. That virus killed nearly 100 million people. Many of the listeners out there probably never had to worry about getting smallpox either. And imagine the days when infection with smallpox meant a 50-50 chance of survival. Because of the miracles of modern science and the success of vaccine development, most of the people out there who are criticizing vaccine programs are alive because of them. Measles is another one of those conditions that we can eradicate. 100,000 people don't have to die every year because of it. The thousands of Americans who are immunocompromised or can't safely receive the vaccine should not have to worry about acquiring this potentially life-threatening disease. And for countries like the US, where a preventive measure is widely available, it feels like an ethical obligation to restrict the spread of the disease. We can make measles a figment of the past. And with a concerted effort by our medical leadership and governmental authorities, our voices can be heard, as long as there are ears to hear them. The BrainWaves podcast is produced at a Studio 3 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Jim Siegler, senior producer. Music for our program this week was courtesy of Advent Chamber Orchestra, Cold Noise, Josh Woodward, Kevin MacLeod, and Lee Rosefier. Sound effects by Mike Koenig and Daniel Simeone. For more information, take a look at the show notes in each week's program for references to the peer-reviewed literature, and follow us on Twitter or Facebook at BrainWaves Audio, or you can email us at bweditorialboard@gmail.com. There are always things that we haven't covered in our programs, so feel free to start up a Twitter thread and help us fill in the gaps. Until next time, I'm Jim Siegler for BrainWaves. Thanks for listening.